Thank you very much. I think, we are at a moment, both India and the US, because we are two large democracies, sort of the world is our oyster here. Given the relationship in trade and in other venues with China, and obviously with Russia, the two large democracies, I think, particularly in the economic side of the equation, can make some tremendous progress if there's a will. I think, speaking from the US side, I must say that I'm disappointed that our trade policy seems to be nothing new, seems to be regurgitating the previous administration's, the Trump administration's trade policy, and there have been really no significant initiatives at all. I'm actually quite surprised as a former trade negotiator. I mean, all that they have done is work on some steel duties, which is obviously important for India, but they've done that now with the EU and Japan. I think the question of a free trade agreement between the US and India would be a terrific step forward. And I would urge India to sort of take the bull by the horns and make a proposal. Because I think, given the latency of the US administration, I think if someone takes the initiative, like in India, I think you might get a positive reaction. It's not going to be an easy negotiation, to be sure, but I think this is an important opportunity. And on the investment side, as we all know, I think the bilateral investment treaty that India has reformed or updated in 2016 is also another opportunity. This refers to what they just negotiated, I think, with the UAE, this bilateral investment treaty. This would be another opportunity, I think, to take that forward with the United States. It's also, of course, important both in the US economy domestically and the Indian economy domestically to put in place reforms that make us be able to trade more freely and less expensively with each other. And in the case of India, for instance, we know that some of the ports are not terribly efficient because they're not very deep. And so there's a lot of trade that has to come through transshipment, through Sri Lanka and other areas, that makes trade more expensive, both exports from the US to come into India and exports out of India to the US. So, there's work to be done domestically in the domestic economy agenda in India. And similarly in the US, we do not do a very good job in dealing with displaced workers on the trade side. So there's a big agenda there as well. But I think, given that India will chair the G20 at the end of this year, this is a really important opportunity for Mr. Modi to take the bull by the horns and make some very important initiatives.
So let me take one step forward from this, Harry. This is an interesting direction I think the conversation is going in. Let's talk a little bit about technology. We know that technology is one of the big drivers of change in the world, and in many ways also creating some of the new mega trends in the world. India and Indians have had a key role to play. While US has been the big technological leader, a lot of that has been run by Indians as individuals or also by Indian companies. Do you think there is an important role here for US and India to play together to allow, since we spoke about China earlier, Mukundan mentioned this, to allow US more freedom from the dependence on China's goods, and for India on the technology side, because we don't even manufacture our own microchips or silicon wafers right now. So is there a win-win available for both sides to pitch in and make an effort together to look at both hardware, software, and the new technologies going forward?
Sunil, you must have read my mind, because this is exactly the point that I wanted to come back to, which is collaboration on research and development between the United States and India. We're both, quite beholden, unfortunately, to China, but I think the world, the democracies again, the open democracies should begin to address more forcefully how to collaborate on research and development, and not so much the basic science, but the applied R&D, the technologies. And one of the issues that I've been working with behind the scenes in the G7 this year has been, how can we put together a new regime of international agreements in science and technology. I used to be the lead negotiator for the US on science and technology agreements. And I think doing something like that with India would resonate extremely well, both from the human capital side and from the industrial strength side. And I say with Mr. Modi taking the lead in the G20, this is another issue, I think, putting on the front burner. How can we collaborate bilaterally, the US, India, on applied R&D? And we can pick a couple of sectors as test beds, but I think it's a no-brainer that I think this is an extraordinarily shared asset that the US and India really should collaborate on.
Right. Thank you. That's an important area. I would completely agree. So let's take this on. You're right. The government can set out policy, the direction, be a facilitator, but then must take a step back when it comes to the actual action. And that must remain the investments, the trade, the business, the services, the goods, the manufacturing must obviously remain with enterprise and companies. So Harry, how do you think India can be the most attractive opportunity as people look at an alternate to China or an addition to China, especially as compared to other Southeast Asian and South Asian nations like Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, etc., because they're also trying to build their economies and their base both of manufacturing and services. India has many unique strengths. What do you believe are the 2 or 3 things India could and should do to be the most attractive of those? We have a natural advantage in terms of size of market, etc. I'm talking other than that now.
Yeah, I mean, I think the earlier point that you raised about how do you keep your eye on the big picture. But at least when I was negotiating, let's talk about growth of flows of trade, growth of flows of investment. And that way you frame the picture in a much more macro sense. Now, obviously the little irritants are gonna creep forward. But I think, as we've been discussing, we got 2 very large democracies, India and the United States. What could India do? I mentioned this a little bit earlier, the infrastructure within India with respect to external trade, I think really is in need of reform and investment. And I mentioned, for instance, the ports, on the eastern seaboard. India is blessed, straddling 2 huge oceans, and is a mega pathway for ocean shipment. But the problem is that the port sector, again, mostly on the eastern side of India, is extraordinarily inefficient. And so you've got ships that are very large that can't come to the ports directly. They've got to offload in a third port, maybe Sri Lanka, and then come back to India on smaller boats. And the problem is that, to be frank, the ports in India are not deep enough to accommodate these larger vessels. And in every country, ports are magnets for protectionism, and the local economy, we understand that, and chambers of commerce understand that. But I think opening up the infrastructure, reforming the infrastructure, and making investments in the Indian infrastructure with respect to trade, with respect to external flows, I think could do an incredible amount of win-win investment and trade flows between the United States and India, and of course other places in the world, which I think will boost India's growth in the world economy.